Perhaps I might just begin by offering respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people on whose land we are this evening as the original owners, custodians, and offer my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So yes, as Kim said, originally she invited me to do a kind of a primer on the Quad, the Quadrilateral Strategic Dialogue, which is an association made up, as I'm sure you know, of Japan, the US, Australia and India. And in fact, originally when it was conceived, the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe conceived of it as a kind of a diamond with 4 points of the diamond being Japan, Hawaii, Australia and India. Since then, of course, there's been a lot of talk about the Quad and also the advent of this most recent association, details of which are very scarce, namely AUKUS, this technology sharing agreement, association, dream, whatever it is, involving, again, the UK, the United States and Australia. This evening I'm going to confine remarks really to the Quad in the context of this strange animal called mini-laterals, which a term which has now come into favour. I'd like to talk about the rise and the significance of these entities in current discourse, then talk a little bit more specifically about the Quad and how it's developed, without focusing per se on AUKUS, although I'd be happy to discuss that in question time later if people wish. Obviously, although the official documents rarely mention China, both these entities are a response to the rise of China and its perceived aggression expressed in various ways. And also, both entities both entities are all about the dynamics of what we now call the Indo-Pacific. So welcome to the Indo-Pacific. The title alone I find sort of interesting and reflect upon because, of course, we used to talk mainly about Asia and the Pacific, and that was a time when Australia predominantly looked north and east to Pacific Asia rather than to east and west. But a little skite here, you know, it's almost 4 decades since, in fact, not long after Rose and I returned from posting in New Delhi, where I was ABC correspondent for some time, we started a program on ABC Radio National called India Pacific, which was a weekly program of analysis, and it was partly inspired as a corrective because at the time the ABC was even more Anglo-centric than it is today. It was also partly a response to the fact that Australia typically looked, as I say, north and east. So it's interesting, then that was at a time when I recall at one stage as an executive of Radio Australia, Foreign Affairs, at a time we were negotiating broadcasting priorities, said, look, oh yes, we've got to get a signal into India, but don't worry too much because as far as Indians are concerned, Australia is almost entirely irrelevant. A bit less so now, Now, essentially, and we all know that the geostrategic environment has changed fundamentally over the last decade or so in particular, and I won't go into all of that, except to say that in terms of Australia's strategic outlook, really there appears to be a focus on 3 particular zones, most immediately Papua New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific, our backyard, which has always been a focus of concern, even in the days when Australia allowed Britain to run its foreign policy. We kept control of relations in the Pacific. The second area, of course, is ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and more recently, we have this other sphere of interest defined by the Quad. Now, each member of the Quad has a slightly different definition of what the Indo-Pacific comprises. From Australia's point of view, it's a region that stretches from the eastern section of the Indian Ocean, so encompassing India, but really nowhere farther west, through to the Pacific via Southeast Asia, up to North Asia and across to the US. As I say, the other members have varying definitions. I think one obvious, really basic thing to say about the Quad, that it's significant in part because of the inclusion of India. There have been, other associations, but really of the traditional allies or long-standing allies, such as Japan, US and Australia. India, as a rising power, as a power that has been traditionally reluctant to move too far away from its original status as a non-aligned power, is central to it, and really, for me, is the defining difference. Australia and India, as probably you know, have had a very mixed record in their bilateral relationship over the decades. Let's not go through the history, but in recent times, I suppose there have been three key developments which have enabled that bilateral relationship to become much more intimate. The first being Australia's decision to reverse an earlier policy not to sell uranium to India. India being not a signatory to the the non-proliferation treaty. The second factor being the rapid increase in Indian migration to Australia. So now, as I understand it, there are some 600,000 people of Indian background residing in Australia. So that, for the first time, provides a cultural bridge between the two countries that extends beyond cricket or curry or the Commonwealth. And the third factor, of course, is China's belligerence. So, having made those initial comments, I'd like to talk briefly about this notion of the mini-lateral association, of which the Quad is an example, and I think AUKUS, this new entity, is also an example. Back in the 20th century, relations in Asia and the Pacific tended to concentrate on either bilateral relationships, one-to-one country, or through multilateral organisations, the large, say, United Nations related organisations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, and the others. As for the United States, which was clearly, the dominant force and balancing factor in the region at that time, it tended to operate on a kind of hub and spoke model of diplomacy and relations. So with its key allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, for example, it would have direct relationships with them, but it was less common for those allies to be having significant relationships together. So Australia had its relationship with the US, South Korea, Japan, and so on. And that was fine in the context of the day, but the day has changed markedly. We're now in what Richard Haas from the foreign relations, the foreign relations scholar in the United States calls a world in disarray, and it's a dangerous time. There's a plausible prospect that there might be a major war in the region within as soon as the decade. The big multilateral institutions are finding it difficult to deal with the range of stresses and problems that exist, whether it be the WHO and the pandemic, or the mediation of competing interests more broadly. Obviously, the big factors at play are the rise of China and to some extent India, the aggressiveness of China in recent times, the conflicts which are, as well as they are about great power shifts, they're also about a competition of systems, of ideologies, of fundamental visions as to what the world should look like. And along with that, of course, we're seeing a growing democracy deficit, not least in the United States. So, in this context, middle powers and great powers are looking to find other ways of defining specific interests and prosecuting those interests with, as our Prime Minister would say, of like-minded countries. So, increasingly, these so-called mini-lateral entities have begun to emerge. As I say, it's where like-minded countries come together to pursue specific interests. They're not alliances as such, they're not treaties, they're associations of convenience which can last for shorter or longer periods and can accommodate differing interests. For instance, India is a key member of the Quad as this mini-lateral entity. India has extreme anxieties at the moment in relation to its continental defence. There have been, even in the last month or so, there's been another incursion by Chinese forces along the line of actual control. Last year they were actually shoving and killing one another, and the military in particular in India is really obsessed with defence against China and Pakistan. At the same time, India is also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, which is very much a creature of China and Russia. So it reflects the sort of foreign policy interests and directions under Prime Minister Modi, who's concerned principally about creating space for India and doing so through what they describe as multi-alignments. So it's spreading the risk, I suppose. So these mini-lateral associations need not be exclusive, they need not be consistent, they need not be without seeming contradictions. Typically, they're very small. It's said that a classic mini-lateral might have members between 3 and 9. The smaller they are, the more sharply focused they are, the more utilitarian they are. That's the theory anyway. Now there's another example of one of these mini-laterals that predated the Quad is the Trilateral Security Dialogue, which is made up of the US, Japan and Australia. Now when that got together, the parties who were increasingly strong allies were concerned with issues about containment of China. They were concerned about what they could do to further cooperation on a range of non-military activities and how that could be to their political benefit. They were there to try to encourage Japan to take a more active role in regional security, to come out of its post-World War II shell, and to provide policy advice and input to the US in terms of American global security interests. It was that group, actually, that had the conversation about an expanded group. That expanded group to include India, which became the Quad. So, having introduced us to the idea of these mini-laterals, let's talk a little bit specifically about the Quad. Its origins date back to about 2004, when, following the devastating tsunami that affected Southeast Asia, the four countries, Japan, the US, India and Australia, actually got together and collaborated in the provision of humanitarian assistance, especially to Indonesia at the time. Now, Rory Medcalf, an eminent Australian who runs the National Security College at ANU, he's made two observations about the provision of that humanitarian assistance at the time. The first was that there were political motivations underlying the humanitarian gesture. Those motivations at the time were less about China. It wasn't quite the issue that it's become, but it was in the middle of the war on terror. And so the political message was to especially Muslim Indonesia: don't worry about the war on terror. Your mates are here to help. However, there was a secondary message inferred from that gesture that Medcalf says China took. China suddenly saw these unlikely collaborators managing to get their navies together in a strategically important maritime zone of critical interest to China to provide assistance that rising China itself was not providing. But the question arose, if they could collaborate on something like this, gee, these people could also collaborate one day in blocking our transportation routes for China's oil importation. So there was immediately a tension that developed. The Quad at that stage, cutting a long story short, the Quad at that stage really didn't go anywhere, not least because China expressed its displeasure at the concept and Australia backed away very quickly. But as Chinese assertion became stronger, partly because of the return to the Prime Ministership of Japan of Shinzo Abe, and partly to, in Australia's case, the changing strategic outlook, the Quad was, in a sense, reborn. Over time, there was an increasing list of anxieties expressed by the members of the Quad. They were concerned about the Chinese militarisation of the artificial islands in the South China Sea. They were worried about the geopolitical implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative, of counter-terrorism concerns they had. They were concerned about North Korea and the fear of nuclear proliferation from that side. Again, increasing concerns about cyber warfare and espionage and the like. The list goes on. Economic development and, of course, eventually pandemic. So after a period in which this association really had little substance except as a symbol of response to the perceived aggression and threat from China, over time it began to consolidate. And this year, for the first time, there was a meeting of heads of government of the four members. And out of that meeting, they set up three specific working groups. One focusing on the vaccine and the need to make the vaccine more readily available to across the region. Second, the climate crisis, although I don't know any detail of what that work involves. And the third area in relation to collaboration over emerging technologies. Now, I'll expand that slightly in a moment, but clearly those sort of working issues represent a much broader sense of security than purely a military focus, and possibly underline the fact that predominantly the Quad, as this rather loose association, is still very much a diplomatic rather than a hard security arrangement, with one qualification I'll come to. One practical manifestation of these working groups is something called the Quad Technical Network, which is being managed by the National Security College at ANU. Recently, they have produced, so it's ANU, but with counterpart organisations in each of the other 3 Quad member states. Recently, they've produced a number of discussion papers to get the juices rolling. There's one about 5G telecommunication networks, issues of risk and resilience. Again, that's obviously with a focus to China and preventing Huawei and Chinese systems from being taken up widely in the region. There's another one with so-called techno-diplomacy in relation to telecommunications. Who knows what that amounts to. Another dealing with battery value chains, something to do with, again, renewables, smart batteries, and security, and trying to assert technical superiority. Governance of critical technologies is another one. So these things are happening, and it does seem that the Quad is putting down some anchors of real endeavour.
Jeff, you'll really have to test your shouting voice, I think. So I'm sorry that there's been a mix-up with the microphones.
That's all right. It's a bit like a rejection slip, isn't it?
No, definitely not.
Now, I said that the Quad is, is principally a sort of a diplomacy-related entity as far as we can work out. There is another Quad-related activity that I should mention, and that is the Malabar naval exercise, which is something that India has been running since about 1992, at first in association with the United States. It's now pretty much an annual event. For a long time, Australia was not invited to participate in it, partly because the Indians threw a wobbly when we wouldn't sell them uranium. But we're now back as an invitee, and we have been providing a ship to take part in these annual exercises. Now, the Indian Chief of Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, he now has described the Malabar naval exercises as one of the cornerstones of military interoperability of the Quad. So he's drawing that connection between the Quad itself and military exercises, which technically are, I think, not part of the Quad. But he's saying the Quad's fundamental charter is to ensure freedom of navigation for all nations through those maritime zones. And they're talking about trying to expand the scope and the membership of the Malabar exercises to Vietnam, to ASEAN countries. I think France has participated in it at some stage, and so on. So look, I'll wrap up. In conclusion, I noted a recent speech by Prime Minister Morrison, who was identifying in these very alarming times a need for a level of cooperation among not only liberal democracies but also so-called like-minded countries at a scale not equalled since the Cold War era. So obviously within that kind of framing, the Quad and AUKUS serve as clear manifestations. But I'd like to say, so far, there's little sign that I can detect of anything approaching the development of a grand strategy to deal with these this geostrategic environment. Some of you might have noted this week a piece in the Financial Review, a commentary by Alan Gingell, the current AIIA president, and John McCarthy, the past president, who were commenting on the lack of Australia's capacity to use its diplomacy to make friends and influence people in the region. That's because really ever since the Howard government era, policy from Australia has become more and more focused on the US alliance, more and more selective in terms of the dealings that we have with multilateral organisations, and more focused on, if you like, the hard power dimensions of relationships. Foreign Affairs as a department, excuse me, Tim, has been marginalised in lots of ways. It's had its resources depleted. The foreign aid budget is minor these days in the scheme of things. And in terms of my own background, what used to be a very potent form of international communication has been neutered entirely. So, you know, one has to ask questions, mini-laterals or whatever, about the status of Australian strategy in dealing with this risky environment. You know, it's, a fellow called Luke's talked about the three faces of power. The first face of power being decisions and a commitment to actions that you have the capacity to do. And, you know, I guess stop the boats might be an example of the first face of power. The second face of power is when you exercise power by not taking decisions. Maybe Australia's position on climate is an example of the second face of power. The third face of power is the capacity to shape, to influence or determine other people's beliefs. Now, the third face of power is obviously associated with the first two faces of power, but is also one that presupposes a far more sophisticated and integrated deployment of statecraft. Statecraft that is multifarious, that involves government and non-government sources, that's far more complicated and far more sophisticated than anything we're seeing at the moment.